Okay, welcome to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. I am extremely excited to be sitting down with a good friend of mine, Chris Thompson. Now, Chris is trained as a lawyer and works for the provincial government in a financial crimes capacity. So his background is wonderful for the conversation we're going to have today about unexplained wealth orders. But I'll let Chris introduce himself, and then we'll get into the topic.
Yes, I'm a proud former lawyer. The practice of law was not for me, but it was an interesting venture that led me to where I am now, which I'm quite happy at. But if you guys Google me, you can probably figure out where I work. But just as a disclaimer, I'm appearing here in my own capacity, and the views I'm about to espouse are mine and mine alone. So,
all right. You have not been sanctioned or officially sanctioned to be on the show. That's
correct.
That's
yeah.
fair. Cool.
Yeah. Nor is it anything we'd actually deal with. Normally, we wouldn't deal with these, but it's of personal interest to me. So,
well, I think, and that's actually why I reached out to you in the first place, is the intersection of your professional obligations right now and your background as a trained lawyer and having worked as a lawyer. Are kind of the perfect intersection for this specific topic. So with all of that being said, the topic today we're going to be talking about is unexplained wealth orders. And I wanted to have this conversation because unexplained wealth orders are newer into Canada, in fact, new into BC only at this point in time, but are a really important tool. We spend our world on the really trusted side of things. We spend our life deep in FinTrack, and FATFA is a big proponent of unexplained wealth orders.
Yes.
And so I think there's some obvious kind of reasons for us to be having a conversation. But let's start at the very beginning, because some of our audience won't necessarily know what an unexplained wealth order is. Some of our audience comes from other provinces. So can you give us like a 2-3 minute intro to what an unexplained wealth order is first of all?
So in one sentence, an unexplained wealth order is an order from a government or an investigatory body to explain the source of funds for an asset. And the context of that is typically you have investigations that go into, that look into criminal bodies or criminal gangs or any types of financial, non-financial crime. And criminals have to hide the money somewhere. And a lot of the times, the investigations, for whatever reason, don't result in criminal charges, or they're hampered in some way, or they can't meet charge threshold, but whatever the case is. But there's these assets that you're reasonably sure are proceeds of crime. I mean, we all know the obvious examples. The 18-year-old kid at your high school that's driving a Bentley, right? And mom works at Safeway, and dad is unemployed or something like. Okay. It does not take a genius to figure out that kid's doing something sketchy.
Positive, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
And so FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, they're a global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. They have said essentially that a country must have a non-conviction-based civil forfeiture unless their constitution forbids it, which is our civil forfeiture under the Civil Forfeiture Office, which is different than an unexplained wealth order. But FATF also says that they should also have a law that forces someone to explain the lawful origin of property.
Interesting.
And so these UWOs are sort of newer in kind of a worldwide context, and there's a number of countries that have started them. But as you were saying, BC, as far as I know, was the first Canadian province to do one.
Yeah. And I mean, from a BC point of view, it came straight out of the Cullen Commission, really.
Yes.
If we go back to where the origins of how we got here are.
I think it was recommendation like 101. It was like 99 of them saying we need people to investigate stuff. And then number 101 was we need a UWO.
We need a new tool in this fight.
Yeah.
Now, I think some of our listeners are probably going to pick up on one of the real challenges, and I think we'll come back to the challenge in a second, but one of the real challenges is that there's kind of a presumption of guilt all of a sudden instead of a presumption of innocence, is what some would say.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think I want to asterisk that up front because I know some people are going to be just focused in on that because that's the first thing you hear.
Yes.
If you're not thinking through that, well, if you're not looking at that in a bigger picture, broader sense kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think where I wanted to kind of go first though was, is this a tool that was necessary? I mean, I acknowledge that FATFA recommends it. And look, like, as a member of the G7, we started FATFA. Like, Canada has clearly bought into all of this things, whether we've done a good job of implementing the recommendations that we signed on for in the first place. It's a whole
Yeah.
other conversation. But many would argue we have not. But that's well outside of the scope. But I guess so. One, are unexplained wealth orders a necessary tool, and are they being used effectively, or where are we in that continuum? I suppose is where I would start.
Yeah, and it depends on what you mean by the word necessary. Like it will be an incredibly useful tool, and it will assist in taking out a lot of organized crime, and not punishing offenders in the legal sense, but removing some of the proceeds of crime. Like they always say, crime doesn't pay. Yeah, it does. Actually, it pays quite well.
That's why crime exists.
Anyone who works in any kind of law enforcement agency will tell you crime pays very well in the general case. I mean, we're all doing our best to stop and deter and detect and assess and disrupt and all those things, but you need tools. And is it necessary? Well, if you want to be able to take steps to remove the proceeds of crime, given the legal infrastructure that we have now, like the charter and all those things, yeah, I would say yes. I mean, is the world going to collapse if we don't have them? Yeah, probably not. We haven't had them forever, up until now, and society hasn't collapsed into anarchy and chaos. But I think it's an incredibly useful tool, or could be an incredibly useful tool, and to again just assist in fighting crime in a different capacity.
Okay, and I want to really double click on something you just said, which I think is hugely important. Crime does pay. Like that's.
Oh yeah.
In fact, that's why crime exists. If you could go and make billions of dollars selling whatever else, you probably wouldn't sell cocaine. Like that's crime pays.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop. And that's fundamentally why I do what I do with the company, is because I do believe that by implementing appropriate controls in businesses, we can actually make a dent in our society and remove some of the crime that we do see. And I like that I'm fully bought in.
Yes.
So that part I'm on board with.
That, to some degree, though, that's more of a preventative thing. Like UWOs are all after the fact.
Well, yeah, but if you can prevent it, if you can make it less likely, if you make it less likely that people are going to get to keep the money at the end of all of this,
yeah, that's true.
They're less likely to want to do it in the first place. It becomes less appealing.
Yes.
Now, UWOs have been in place in other jurisdictions.
Yes.
And I know you did a bit of reading into that ahead of time. Maybe walk us through. We were talking about off-air. We were talking about a case in London. That seems like a particularly interesting, useful to illustrate why these are important tools in the fight of in financial investigation support.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the aspects of this being a relatively new thing is that it's been used. You start with sort of the most egregious cases, and you don't want to go with a brand new law to the court and try and test its constitutionality on like a marginal case, right? You want to go in there where your brief can be like, "Dear court, duh," sign the plaintiffs, right? And that seems to have been the case for a lot of the UWOs that I've seen so far. So the example I've got, a lot of this is from a report, and it's a Star Wealth report, which you can just Google. It's quite interesting if you like reading 128 pages on obscure legal.
Some of our listeners probably do, actually, to be honest. So,
probably 100% of the people at this table do. So that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is a case that's the Hajieva case out of the UK. This was 2018. So there was a guy who worked in the government of Azerbaijan. He moved to London, he and his wife. And over the previous 10 years, so from 06 to 2016, she spent 16 million pounds, so about 20 million US, at Harrods, which is a luxury department store. They bought a house for 13.2 million US dollars, which were expenses that were vastly out of keeping of what her husband could make in his own home country. And their house was owned by a British Virgin Islands BVI company linked to both her and her husband. So this drew the attention of the UK authorities, as also her husband had been convicted in 2016 of misappropriation and fraud. He got 15 years in jail and was ordered to pay $39 million. And so some of the funnier things is, like, she spends $20 million at Harrods, $2 million at Harrods a year, And there was one I found, she spent, let me pull it up here. She spent, I think, she spent 600,000 pounds in one day on a spending spree. She also spent, I think, like $30,000 in one shot to Godiva chocolates.
It's a couple of chocolates.
That's a couple of, yes. I don't know, how long would it take you to eat $30,000 of Godiva? But
That's a pretty high quality chocolate.
True. So not exactly a sympathetic case. And so here's a case where, okay, this guy's been convicted I assume he was convicted in Azerbaijan and sentenced in order to prison. And this woman's later living in London with what are kind of obviously proceeds of crime.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no way this guy can buy this money legally. So then the question becomes, okay, if you don't have unexplained wealth orders, how do you prevent this type of living large based off your crime? And I mean, she's not convicted of a crime. You know, it's arguable whether or not she's done anything wrong. Like she's just been given a blank check from her husband, and maybe she hasn't. But still, these are the proceeds of crime. And if you want to make crime not pay, you got to go after these types of things.
You absolutely have to.
Yeah, and so they did, and that was the first case.
So you started by talking, and I think we didn't go into the distinction, which I'm hopefully about to make, which is you started by talking about this is an investigative tool.
Yes.
And this case just ended up in what sounded more like forfeiture, in fact. Can we just parse apart for our listeners a little bit for a second, the difference there between forfeiture and investigation?
In some cases, I mean, it might, legally there's a difference. There might be a distinction without a difference for the general public, but an unexplained wealth order in and of itself is just an order from the court for a subject to provide information on the source of wealth for a property. So like, hey, okay, you know, haul someone out of gym class and get them to explain where they got the money for their Bentley. Like that's it. It's a court order. You have to go to court. You have to file a bunch of stuff. And the court will say, yes, okay, you can make this person tell you where they got the money from. And that's it. It doesn't give you the authorization to seize it. It doesn't give you any other powers. You can't freeze it. You can't do any of those things. You just have the power to compel the person to provide the information. And then if the information is insufficient, and well, there's then, I'm not looking into that now. There's three possibilities.
Yeah, I think this is natural.
Yeah. Okay. So the court grants the order. Well, let me back up a sec. So what the person has to provide is an affidavit to the court. So there's going to be some kind of investigator. They have to swear an affidavit to a court saying, and this is BC specific.
Yeah.
It varies a little bit around the world, but the idea is the same.
And I should say, I think we've got it a little bit wrong. Manitoba has also introduced them, but hasn't used them yet.
Oh, okay.
But BC is the first to use them, and clearly, directionally, it seems likely that other provinces will follow suit. I like to joke that BC lives in the future on a lot of regulatory stuff.
Yep.
So
the bleeding edge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes. So if you think, the high school kid's Bentley is proceeds of crime, what you have to say is on an affidavit, there's a reason to suspect a person is involved in illegal activities or is a politically exposed person. You have to have a reason to believe that the person has an interest in the underlying property that you're looking to investigate.
Mm-hmm.
The property has to be worth more than $75,000. So you can't be like, hey, where's that watch from? PFO. Like, no, go pound sand. And there has to be a serious question to be tried that one of these three things are true, that the known sources of income are insufficient to acquire or maintain the property was used to engage in unlawful activity, or the property was acquired or maintained as a result of unlawful activity. And again, none of these are beyond a reasonable doubt or even balance of probabilities. So, balance of probabilities is 50% plus one.
Yeah.
Someone, a trier of fact, a court, or whoever has to find that it's more likely than not that something happened. That's not the standard here. You've got reason to suspect the person is involved in illegal activities. You have to have a reason to believe that the person has the interest in the property. And the legal term serious question to be tried basically means it has to make sense what you're saying. Like you can't just conjure stuff up out of thin air.
So a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the concept of reasonable grounds to suspect, because that's when the threshold for a suspicious transaction report must be filed.
Okay.
For FINTRAC filing purposes. And so this distinction becomes really important and really, to me, interesting, actually, because what you're saying is that an unexplained wealth order doesn't rise to the same level as if I'm hearing you right anyway, doesn't have to have absolute fact or doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt.
No, no.
That's interesting.
And that's, again, the civil standard. There's no jail time. People's liberty isn't, and no one's liberty is threatened here. So you don't need that beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
Okay.
And that's where some of the controversy comes from, is people saying like, well, hey, they haven't been convicted of a crime. They haven't been any of this stuff. That
Quite.
The onus to prove your innocence is put on the person who owns the asset. Now, legally speaking, like conceptually, maybe that's true, depending on how sophisticated your understanding of criminal law is. But to be found guilty of something, you have to be charged with a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's being charged with the crime. Therefore, you're not innocent of anything anyway. Like, you're not guilty, you're not innocent. There's no possibility of you being found guilty of something because you're not being charged with a crime.
Right.
So there's no onus on you to prove your innocence of anything because you're not being charged with a crime. There's an onus on you to show that this property at question isn't the proceeds of crime, or at least that you acquired it illegally.
And I guess the debater in me would then say, sure,
Yep.
but if I can't prove that I acquired this legally, the assumption is that I acquired it illegally.
That's correct.
And that is an interesting turn from how we normally view a lot of things in Canada, I think.
Maybe. I mean, if you're used to looking at things in the criminal context, that's true.
Yeah.
But anyone who's ever filed their taxes knows that
I was hoping you'd bring this in.
it's all back to tax. I worked as a tax lawyer. It's all about tax. There's certain situations in life where the subject or the person who owns an asset at question is really the only one that can make sense of something that happened. So I wouldn't expect CRA to file my taxes because I know what I did during the year. I know how my accounting structure is set up. I know, I earn a wage. It's fairly straightforward. Like CRA could probably be pretty close to doing my taxes, but I own a house and I got rental income.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be able to parse through all my bank accounts and figure out how much I spent on rental maintenance. Like, they're just not,
right,
without outrageous amounts of efforts. So there's a quote with something like the taxpayer is in the unique position of knowing all the information about the subject, right? So what it's the theory of these unexplained wealth orders is that it's not practical for the government to figure out where you got the money to buy this asset from. Like, that's going to be prohibitively complicated for someone who has to compel bank records and transfers. And a lot of these assets, I mean, if you're any good at money laundering, the money will come from overseas. Like, it's if you paid for your Bentley with a check drawn on a Panama bank,
yeah,
like, good luck, right? It's going to take us years to figure that out.
to be able to track it down.
And we just don't have the resources to do that.
Okay.
So I think unexplained wealth orders are a means to level the playing field between law enforcement and criminals, because law enforcement just doesn't have the resources to figure all this stuff out. But it's very, very easy for someone, most of the time, we can get into when it's not, but most of the time it's fairly easy for someone who legitimately acquired an asset to prove how they legitimately acquired it. Like, I own a house, I'd okay, Chris, prove how you own this house, how you bought this house. Okay, well, here's the mortgage documents, here's the money, here's where I sold my old house, here's the bank records where it all came through, here's my income for the last, like, it's easy. I can do it in 10 minutes, right?
Fair enough. And in fact, going back to your taxes, your taxes would probably support your case because that's legitimately where the money came, and you weren't trying to hide.
Yeah,
I think you weren't trying to hide any money into that. So
yes,
yeah,
yes, of course. Yeah.
No, that part
makes part out.
Yeah. So I think.
Now, sorry, the one part where it does get interesting is if it's like, I bought this house 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, I can't get the bank records.
No.
Banks keep records for 7, 8, 9 years. And I don't know if anyone's even looked at that yet. Like, the cases in BC are the ones, again, where they're what are called unsympathetic defendants, where it's like, well, duh.
Yes.
But yeah, there's going to be, at some point, I think someone's going to say, like, hey, man, yeah, I had a great night at a casino on my 50th birthday 17 years ago, and then I deposited the money to the bank account, but the bank records are gone. So that's a bridge someone's going to have to cross at some point.
That doesn't sound like a fun bridge to have to cross. I gotta be honest with you.
Well, and the other side of it is maybe then the government will just think, like the detractors of the people who are arguing against this law, they're going to say stuff like, and it's legitimate that it can be abused. Taxpayers may not have the documentation. Like all of that's true, or at least it's plausible.
Yeah.
Now there are safeguards in that this stuff has to go through a court. Like someone in a law enforcement capacity, like I wouldn't be able to just go and see someone's Bentley and like start driving it around.
Well, thank goodness.
And that's I probably wouldn't be able to fit in the Bentley. But anyway, a lot of almost any law enforcement power can be abused, but that's what we have the courts for. And I think most law enforcement agents and most law enforcement agencies, almost all the time, are trying to do proper and effective investigations. And I've been in situations where I'm like, okay, I ask for some information. The person's like, hey man, X happened. It's no one's fault. Like I had a flood in the basement 10 years ago. Here's the records. Like the sewage backed up. Like you want the box? Like it's all yours, man. It's like no, that's okay.
You keep that.
And you give people the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
If there's sort of legitimate reason to. But again, this UWO is the one situation where you're not giving people the benefit of the doubt as a policy.
Yeah.
But I think there's different reasons where if you've got something that's wildly uncharacteristic with your income, well, you should have the paperwork, especially if it's recent.
It's interesting. I think that, like, as we've talked through this, to me, the most obvious immediate use case for this that I think will be interesting when it eventually happens, is the common example of where real estate brokerages are failing in their FinTrack obligations is when the homemaker or the student buys the West Side house. And I mean,
right.
It's such a cliche example that I think it's almost a meme at this point. But
yeah, we've had a few of those where you pull land title and it's like, owner is so-and-so, student 99%, and then 1% mom in wherever.
Right.
Like,
that
I have questions.
And now suddenly maybe would that be a good example of a case where an unexplained wealth order might be useful?
If there's ties to crime.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a fishing expedition.
Okay.
We cannot just look at, the government or whatever, the civil forfeiture office or anyone, the police just can't go wandering around saying like, you own an Aston Martin, tell me how you bought it. No, if you're just a law-abiding citizen and there's no reasonable grounds to suspect them all these other pieces that you're actually tied to organized crime, you're not going to get an unexplained wealth order.
It's that third part of that three-part test that actually was important that I think is the part that kind of gives us some comfort and protection, I guess, is what you're suggesting.
Well, there's the third part is the serious question to be tried is the known sources of income are insufficient, properties. We still have to go to court with a bunch of facts.
Right. Okay.
We can't just show up with some dude with a shiny thing and say like, hey, I want that shiny thing. Can you get him to prove to us how he bought it? Like, no, there's a process to go through.
So not a tool of bureaucratic lawfare.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I think we've started to cover this a fair bit, and I think I just want to kind of make sure we've addressed it because I think it's the one thing that people generally kind of get their backs up against the wall. As you quite rightly said, the BC Civil Liberties Association, came out pretty hard against unexplained wealth orders.
Yeah.
And what's the case against? And I guess what's the rationale where you think this probably passes the smell test at a court of law ultimately?
Yeah. So the case against, again, as like you were saying, is we have a presumption of innocence.
Yeah.
The general public writ large has the right to just go about our daily lives without harassment from police or any investigatory body, generally, right? And the idea is that in order for the subject of the scrutiny of the state, they must have some kind of evidence or probable cause, or whatever your standard is. Like that, we generally have a right to be left alone, right?
Yeah.
And this is a situation where people feel that your right to be left alone and your right to be innocent until proven guilty, that those two things are kind of being violated. One of the other rights, again, in the charter, or not in the charter, sorry, but one of our rights is innocent until proven guilty. Like that is a fundamental concept in
our criminal system.
in our criminal systems and pretty much everyone's around the world.
Yeah.
That we would sooner let 99 guilty people go free than put one innocent person behind bars, and I think that's the right way to go.
Yeah.
And then it's certainly frustrating in law enforcement's jobs at times, but it's not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be easy to lock someone up or take their money or give them sanctions. And so the opponents say this concept of we shouldn't have to prove our innocence, and this concept of basically being left alone by the state unless we've done something wrong, both of those are at odds with the idea of unexplained wealth order.
Quite. Yeah.
And like the Azerbaijani lady, has she done anything criminal? I don't know, maybe not.
Oh.
Like there was no allegations. She hasn't been charged with anything. She hasn't been convicted of anything. All she's done is married some guy who probably extorted millions of dollars out of whoever, and then she is just living off the luxury.
Yeah.
Right?
She somehow managed to spend $30 million while her husband made about $1 million in the same period of time. So,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the next step of that, so my rationale is, well, not my rationale, I think everyone's rationale is it conscionable to think that, okay, just because someone isn't convicted of a crime, that they should be able to live off the proceeds of crimes.
Yeah.
And if, like you take the counter example, like it's, brother A and brother B. Brother B is a drug dealer, earns a bunch of money, buys brother A Bentley and a house and all these other things. Okay, well, do we want to let brother A keep the Bentley in the house? I kind of think no. I mean, brother A hasn't committed a crime. He hasn't done anything wrong. I just don't think in sort of a legal system writ large, and FATF agrees with me on a worldwide basis, that it just doesn't make sense. It would offend the sensibilities of most people.
Yeah.
To see like the little brothers of drug dealers being able to keep their Bentleys and all these other proceeds of crime forever.
It does make it a bit easier to become a criminal while you personally might not be advanced. If your entire family and the ones you love or whatever will be, then yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah.
Doesn't work. Yeah.
One of the other things you got to think about too with these unexplained wealth orders is that one of the goals was to really go after the heads of organized crime gangs.
Okay.
Because they're typically structured in a way that the people up at the top aren't the ones going out and committing the day-to-day criming, but they're the ones that have the mansions. They're crimers do crime. They criming. You need to stop criming.
Carry on.
Yeah. So yeah, the heads of organized crime gangs, the money funnels up, and they're the low level guys that keep getting charged with whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
And if you want to go after the upper level echelon people, it's going to be really, really hard to get everyone to flip on the way up. And an easier way to do it is just take all their stuff.
Right.
And if you can prove that all of this stuff, or at least with an unexplained wealth order, if they're unable to prove that all of their assets or whatever assets you're investigating weren't proceeds of crime, sorry, too many negatives there. If the upper members of the crime gang can't prove a legitimate source of their assets,
right,
then I don't think anyone's going to be against taking toys away from gangsters.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the more sympathetic approach to this, which is like the guy living in the $20 million mansion who has hundreds of people selling little baggies of Coke.
Yeah,
I don't like Coke is my thing today, but I've mentioned it twice.
You're interviewing a lawyer?
I guess so, yeah.
Sorry. Our stereotypical,
Yeah. But
oh crap! I want a BMW too. Damn it!
Oh,
and it's black, but the turn signals work. I use them all the time.
Yeah. So, but anyhow, I think that becomes a much more sympathetic argument for general people to accept, I think. So.
Yeah, and one of the other reasons too is a lot of the times it's really hard, if not impossible, to get documents from other jurisdictions.
Okay.
So if you want to prove that that the particular source of funds for something was illegitimate and it comes from Saudi Arabia or Lithuania or I think the Philippines, don't quote me on that one though, Like there's some jurisdictions where various law enforcement agencies in Canada have agreements with various law enforcement agencies around the world, both civil and criminal. Criminal, it's typically called an MLAT, a mutual legal assistance treaty. Those take years.
Right. Okay.
And so if you are a criminal and you run your funds through 5 countries and it takes 2 years to get an MLAT, it's going to take you 10 years to figure out where the money came from. And that's just not feasible. And so criminals know that, and then they use that. And so these orders are an attempt to sort of level the playing field between the criminals that understand the financial obscurity system or how to obscure their finances and law enforcement.
Which is why, I mean, I guess if I go, federal policing would become a better federal policing force who had the tools like unexplained wealth orders is probably better suited to fight some of these transnational crimes, which you're suggesting.
Well, I mean, we have federal police, we have the RCMP. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a lack of policing effort. I think it's just a function of how the system works, like the international system.
Yeah.
And I know the steps involved. I was at a conference the other day. They said it takes, the investigator has to draft an order, and then they send it, I think, to Crown, and then that takes a while, and then it comes back with some corrections, and it goes back and forth, and it gets approved somewhere else. And then it has to go to some office, and then the office sends it. It has to get officially translated into like Dutch or something. But then the lady who does the official Dutch translations is on a 2-week kayaking trip in like, I don't know, Nunavut or whatever it was. And so she has to come back, and then the translation happens, and it gets sent over to the Netherlands. And then, I don't know, whatever Dutch guy does the translation. Like, it's this exercise. It's nuts. And I kind of liken it to, this is my standard analogy. Do you know how this is how I understand tennis used to be played. So do you know where the numbers in tennis come from? Like the 0, 15, 30, 40?
Yeah, okay, no.
So it used to be that when you started, you both stood at like a line, which let's call 0.
Okay.
When you won a point, you went 15 feet ahead.
Oh.
And then when you won that point, you went to 30 feet. And then when that point, you went to 40 feet. And when you won that, you won the match. I feel that's sort of like how the approvals process in law enforcement works. You start at line 0, and then you go with your supervisor. And then you hit the ball back and forth. And eventually you hit a winner, and then they approve it. And you move up to line 15, which is the next level of approval. And you hit the ball back and forth a bunch of times. Eventually you hit a winner, and then you go up to line 30. And then like line 40 is whatever director of the institution you're running who has to ultimately sign off on this thing. And then
who might actually get you somewhere all of a sudden.
Or who hits it back, and then you have to go back to line 0 and start over again.
That sounds terrible.
It is, yeah. I've said my job is 80% pretty good, 10% awesome, and 10% mind-numbingly tedious. And some of that is the mind-numbingly tedious part. It's just this endless series of back and forth.
Right.
Now, that's not all the time. That's fairly rare. Most of the time, the stuff gets touched like once or twice. But for something where it's like overseas requests are everyone knows they're a pain and they take forever. And it's you're kind of coordinating among a bunch of different institutions and dealing with different languages and different time zones, and it's a pain. So these unexplained wealth orders are kind of a means of leveling that playing field between the criminals and investigative bodies.
Right. Okay. And really making the transnational side of it a little bit easier. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really kind of a helpful analysis in unexplained wealth orders. Ultimately, I think why they're important, and I think the case that they may not, the civil liberties they might impact. Let me put it that way.
Yep.
And ending that whole balance of whether they're good or bad and necessary or evil or whatever. I think we've hopefully gone through that enough that our listeners get a good sense of that. So. Thank you so much, Chris, for understanding the topic and being willing to spend your time with me talking about it.
No problem. Happy to be here.
And thanks for being on the show.
Awesome. Thanks.
Take care. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. If you'd like more information about our guests, have a story idea, or want to be a guest, please reach out to hello@kycpodcast.com. If you want to discuss your anti-money laundering compliance needs with a member of the Really Trusted team, go to www.reallytrusted.com/consult.